What is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. James Madison.
That's the place where our government works. It's the engine of democracy. This is our most important building. We're so accustomed to seeing our history measured by the presidency that we forget the extent to which the real story of our country takes place right there. That's the place to go, to the Hill. All the voices are there.
The House will be in order. Our prayer will be offered by the chaplain.
O God, as we think on the glories of your spiritual world, may we also
folks,
see
as you
how
enter
these
the
glories
rotunda,
can be
please grab a
realized
ticket,
in our
one per
daily
person,
lives.
for a tour of the historic section of the building.
Now standing in the original
All the way
section of the Capitol, George Washington and Pierre
L'Enfant بشم John Quincy Adams هو هنسي هالشيشي
Those soldiers never die. They just fade away.
Senator McCarthy, have you no sense of decency, sir?
Mr. Rodino.
Aye. It is possible for an American
Mr. Rangel.
to disagree with you on aid to the countries
Miss Jordan.
and still love God and still
Mr.
love
Speaker,
this country.
the official state song of my home state is entitled Beautiful Nebraska. I want my colleagues to know about the accomplishments
With
of
Congress,
Nebraska.
every time they make a joke, it's a law. You know. And every time they make a law, it's a joke.
Look, there it is.
Who? What?
The Capitol Dome.
Yes, sir. Big as life. Been there a long time now.
Yes, sir. This way, Senator.
The Congress and the President, and I guess the Supreme Court, they're the three things we got. But the Congress is where we speak. The Congress is where we are. The Congress is where ordinary mortals go about the business of compromise which gets us through the day.
Congress is the first branch of government in the sense that it is the reminder that people in a republic are supposed to do their own business, and they are not supposed to abdicate their business to someone else.
There was still some lingering thought, you know, that made a mistake in giving up the idea of a king. Benjamin Franklin came along, said the story is, he came along and he stopped and listened a moment. And when there was a chance to say a word, he just said this, says, in America, the people govern.
This huge grey hall filled with perpetual clamour, this multitude of keen and eager faces, this ceaseless coming and going of many feet, this irreverent public watching from the galleries and forcing its way onto the floor, all speak to the beholder's mind of the mighty democracy destined in another century to form one half of civilized mankind, whose affairs are here debated. Of what tremendous struggles may not this hall become the theatre in ages yet far distant, when the parliaments of Europe have shrunk to insignificance.
1 mile east and 88 feet above the Potomac River, on what was once called Jenkins Heights, stands the most recognizable building in America. Designed by an Englishman, inspired by a Russian church, decorated by Italian craftsmen, and built in part by slaves, it is the nearest thing Americans have to a national temple. Davy Crockett sat here. So did Joseph Pulitzer and Horace Greeley, and William Randolph Hearst and Emily Dickinson's father, and Isidore Straus, the founder of Macy's, and a man who pitched a perfect game for the Philadelphia Phillies in 1964. Over 10,000 men and women have served here. Farmers and housewives, Rhodes Scholars and ex-slaves, astronauts and priests, basketball stars and convicted felons, school teachers and playwrights, and lawyers, always lawyers.
If the present Congress err too much in talking, how can it be otherwise in a body to which the people send 150 lawyers whose trade is talk by the hour?
One member has gone insane in office. One has taken maternity leave, and several have served jail terms for bribery. Members have fought on the floor with fists and fire tongs, shot each other on dueling grounds, and been shot at from the galleries. 23 from Congress have become president. In 200 years, Congress has, in the name of the people, pushed open the West, built railroads, freed slaves, made war, passed Social Security, put GIs through college, and paid to land men on the moon. They've driven Indians from their land, outlawed alcohol, and filibustered without mercy. They've created Mother's Day and daylight savings time, dominated presidents and been dominated by them, started wars and stopped them. Congress, Thomas Jefferson said, is the great commanding theater of this nation. It is the place where laws are made.
He was once asked by a rather impatient man at the Constitutional Convention, Mr. Madison, could you please tell us what are the principles, if there are any, to be of American government? And he said, yes, there are three. Compromise, compromise, compromise.
I am most impressed by their imagination. This was a leap of the imagination. The idea that you're going to turn over to the people, through their representatives, the power to make war and the power to tax.
That the people who were going to either take your money away or take your sons away were the people who had to go home every single, at that point it wasn't every weekend, but it was the notion that they had to be up for re-election every 2 years.
It's hard to imagine that when they met in New York, there was no structure for them to begin with. And they invented this Congress that still exists today, recognizing that every decision they made in those 2 years would become a precedent for as long as the Congress endured. If that's not a miracle that we had that kind of political talent available in a small country of 4 million people at that time in our history, I don't know what a miracle is.
You and I, dear friend, have been sent into life at a time when the greatest lawgivers would have wished to live. How few of the human race have ever enjoyed an opportunity of making an election of government for themselves and their children. John Adams.
In 1789, kings still ruled in France and England, a czar in St. Petersburg, a sultan in Constantinople, a divinely invested emperor in Peking, and a shogun in Japan. But on March 4th, 1789, in the sun-filled chambers of New York City Hall, newly remodeled as a temporary capital, the first Congress of the United States took up its business under the new Constitution. Only 21 members showed up, however, and the first Congress adjourned without a quorum.
This is a very mortifying situation. We lose credit, spirit, everything. The public will forget the government before it is born. The resurrection of the infant will come before its birth. Representative Fisher Ames.
When they finally all assembled, Congress addressed itself to 10 constitutional amendments, a Bill of Rights, guaranteeing, among other things, the separation of church and state. The House then picked a former preacher for its first speaker, Frederick Muhlenberg of Pennsylvania. They created new departments of state, treasury, and war, devised the machinery of committees, and set President George Washington's salary at the huge sum of $25,000 a year, all the time improvising freely. They were inventing Congress, and they were inventing themselves.
I am vice president. In this I am nothing, but I may be everything. But I am also president of the Senate. When the president comes into the Senate, who shall I be? John Adams?
I'd like to have been a reporter at the first Congress, in the first days, when those guys came in there to invent what they'd planned at Philadelphia. And there was a moment when the president had a treaty for the Senate to ratify. Well, the Senate had never ratified a treaty. There'd never been a Senate. There'd never been a treaty. George Washington bore the treaty to the Capitol in his hand, and he delivered it to the Senate, and he said, in effect, ratify it. And the Senate took it and looked at it a while and said, well, yes, sir, yeah. And it became clear that Washington expected them to ratify it. And the Senate asserted itself, not knowing what it was asserting, and said, we'll have to look at it. Washington paced the halls, irritated, angered. The Senate told him that they believed it would take till tomorrow, or maybe another day, and Washington had to leave the Capitol and go home, and he never returned to the Capitol. But the Senate had asserted that it would do what the founders, which George Washington agreed with, they ratified a treaty by arguing about it and making a little change somewhere, and the government was operating.
After leaving Baltimore, we wandered about for 2 hours without finding a guide or a path. Woods are all you can see from the time you leave Baltimore until you reach the city, which is so only in name. I have been to Georgetown. It is the very dirtiest hole I ever saw for a place of any trade or respectability of inhabitants. Abigail Adams.
After a year in New York and 10 in Philadelphia, Congress finally found a permanent home. Government settled on the banks of the Potomac at the west end of Jenkins Heights. The move was made in June 1800. The government's documents came by sailing ship. Clerks, congressmen, and John Adams, now President Adams, by stagecoach and horseback. A Library of Congress was established, and a sum of $15 million voted to purchase all Louisiana territory, doubling the size of the country. An additional appropriation of $2,500 went to Lewis and Clark to find out what $15 million had bought. Congress was boisterous, homespun, enlivened now by a two-party system, and outraged over British harassment of American shipping. Some wanted war. Most persuasive of these war hawks was a young congressman from Kentucky.
Clay is an eloquent man with very popular manners and great political management. His school has been the world. and in that he is proficient. His morals, public and private, are loose, but he has all the virtues indispensable to a popular man.
On November 4th, 1811, his first day as a member of the House of Representatives, Henry Clay was elected Speaker. He was tall, gallant, shrewd, and ambitious, a natural leader. Only 35 years old, he took his place in the Great Chamber and quickly challenged the White House in its handling of foreign affairs. The balance of power shifted to Congress and to Henry Clay.
Sir, no man in the nation wants peace more than I. But I prefer the troubled ocean of war with all its calamities to the tranquil and putrescent pool of ignominious peace.
In June of 1812, the Congress of the United States declared war for the first time, then adjourned without voting the taxes to pay for it. 2 years later, the British invaded Washington. Congress was not in session when the British Army marched into the city and burned the Capitol. But the problems had just begun. Two great questions have prevailed all the way through, from the time of the earliest Congresses right up until the present. And those are civil rights and growth.
I suppose the crucial moment in the 19th century was when this nation was trying to avert the tragedy of the Civil War, which finally overpowered the statesmen of that era. But there were men, Clay and others, who tried and used up their lives and careers trying to avert that calamity. And that would have been a time to have been a fly on the wall in the Capitol.
The mists of morning still hung around the magnificent building when first it broke upon our view. We were struck with admiration and surprise. None of us, I believe, expected to see so imposing a structure on that side of the Atlantic. The beauty and majesty of the American Capitol might defy an abler pen than mine to do it justice. It stands so finely, too, high and alone. Francis Trollope.
By 1819, the Capitol had been rebuilt under the direction of Benjamin Latrobe and Charles Bulfinch. There were spacious new chambers for both houses, joined by a handsome rotunda and a low wooden dome sheathed in copper. A proud Congress sat while the artist Samuel F.B. Morse painted it in session in its new quarters, then subsidized his new telegraph system. Growth and improvements were the spirit of the times. But because of confusion as to whether the Senate or the House had authority in the rotunda, merchants set up shop there and sold stoves, pianos, and mousetraps.
Let us then bind the Republic together with a perfect system of roads and canals. Let us conquer space. We are rapidly, I was about to say fearfully, growing. John C. Calhoun.
But there was one problem that could unbind the Republic. As each new state was added to the Union, it threatened to tear the country apart. Southerners feared the North might forbid slavery. Northerners feared slavery might move west.
There was never a moment in our history when slavery was not a sleeping serpent. It lay coiled up under the table during the deliberations of the Constitutional Convention. Thereafter, slavery was on everyone's mind, if not always on his tongue.
The first great crisis came in 1820. After fierce debate, Congress passed the Missouri Compromise, admitting Maine as a free state and Missouri as a slave state. Henry Clay engineered the compromise using all the force of his extraordinary personality. There was widespread relief. They had saved the Union, for now.
All legislation is founded upon the principle of mutual concession. Let him who elevates himself above humanity say, if he pleases, I never will compromise. But let no one who is not above the frailties of our common nature disdain compromise.
It was a time of oratory, and there were giants on Capitol Hill. Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri, the voice of Western expansion, who had once shot Andrew Jackson in a street brawl. Sam Houston, future president of Texas, who sat in the House chamber whittling a pine stick. John Quincy Adams, old man eloquent, who, like no other former president, went back to serve in the House. And Webster, godlike Daniel of Massachusetts. It was said no man was ever so great as Daniel Webster looked or sounded.
When my eyes shall be turned to behold for the last time the sun in the heavens, may I not see him shining on the broken fragments of a once glorious union, on a land rent with civil feuds, or drenched, it may be, in fraternal blood. Let their last feeble and lingering glance rather behold the gorgeous ensign of the Republic, still full high advanced, liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable.
Speech by speech, compromise after compromise, words held the country together. Generations of school children learned Webster's words by heart and took them to heart.
Before delivering a speech, he often appeared absent-minded. Rising to his feet, he seemed to recover perfect self-possession, which was aided by thrusting the right hand within the folds of his vest, while the left hung gracefully by his side. His dark complexion grew warm with inward fire. His eyes would start from their cavernous depths.
Webster was a genial host, a warm friend of business and of the sideboard and decanter, and not averse to taking cash gifts from admirers. Henry Clay, too, enjoyed his whiskey and high living, gambling and horse racing. A war hawk no more, he had become the supreme charmer of American politics, the great compromiser.
I don't like Henry Clay. He is a bad man, an imposter, a creator of wicked schemes. I wouldn't speak to him, but by God I love him. John C. Calhoun.
Somber, intellectual John C. Calhoun had no interest in compromise. Like Clay, he was a slave owner, but unlike Clay, he became so single-minded in his defense of the institution that he seemed possessed. He gave up the vice presidency to take a seat in the Senate, to lead the Southern cause.
Nothing can be more unfounded and false than the prevalent opinion that all men are born free and equal, for it rests upon the assumption of a fact which is contrary to universal observation. John C. Calhoun.
Here is our country upon the very verge of a civil war, which everyone pretends to be anxious to avoid. Yet everyone wants his own way, irrespective of the wishes of others. Henry Clay.
The feeling among the Southern members for dissolution of the Union is becoming more general. Men are now beginning to talk of it seriously who 12 months ago hardly permitted themselves to think of it. The crisis is not far ahead. Alexander Stephens.
When the cornerstone of the Capitol was laid, there were only 209 post offices in the country. By 1850, there were 21,551. Gold had been found in California. Texas was in the Union. The country now stretched all the way to the Pacific.
It is our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions.
There are grave doubts at the hugeness of the land, and whether one government can comprehend the whole.
The next crisis came in 1850 over California.
Would the new state be slave or free? Clay took the floor on February 5th. He had arrived at the Capitol so weak he had to be helped up the steps. But in the overheated chamber, he spoke nearly 3 hours, pleading for another compromise. He warned that the Union might be destroyed and called for a free California to please the North. To please the South, he proposed to strengthen the law that returned runaway slaves to their owners. Clay knew what a concession he was asking of Webster and the North.
You are numerically more powerful than the slave states, and greatness and magnanimity should ever be allied together.
Calhoun, racked with fever, too ill even to talk, sat wrapped in a black cloak, glaring defiance while his speech was read for him by James Mason of Virginia. He was sure the abolitionists would make slaves into masters and masters into slaves. On March 7th, Daniel Webster took his turn. Plagued by insomnia for weeks, he reinforced himself with drugs. It was his last great speech.
Mr. President, I wish to speak today, not as a Massachusetts man nor as a Northern man, but as an American and a member of the Senate. I speak for the preservation of the Union. Hear me for my cause.
He had made a brave decision. He would support the Clay Compromise, including the fugitive slave law his constituents so despised, because he thought it the only way to stave off civil war. Clay and Webster won. The Compromise of 1850 held the Union together for 10 more years. But Webster, Clay, and Calhoun were spent. Defiant until the end, Calhoun died even before the Compromise was enacted into law. Clay and Webster died in 1852. Henry Clay of Kentucky was the first man to lie in state in the rotunda of the Capitol.
I like oratory. It's one of my character failings, and Webster, Clay, Calhoun apparently were three just magic orators. I would have sat and I would have listened as you would listen to a great Wurlitzer somewhere. I would have, I hope, been absolutely awed at the way in the middle of all that mellifluence raging, they were isolating issues as very few members are able to do today. They were speaking about the greatest divisions in the country with incredible precision apart from their eloquence. But when I'm in the presence of that, I read about it the next day. I sit and listen as to the concert.
Now Capitol Hill became a construction site. 2 huge new wings were planned, grand stairways, sumptuous reception rooms, and a new dome. The architect was from the north, Thomas Walter of Pennsylvania. The man in charge was from the south, Jefferson Davis of Mississippi. But while the Capitol was growing, the country was coming apart. Finally, words failed. On the floor of the Senate, South Carolina Congressman Preston Brooks savagely beat the abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts with a cane. Sumner tried so desperately to get away, he wrenched his desk loose from the floor. Members of the House began carrying pistols. In November of 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. In December, South Carolina seceded from the Union. There were more and more empty seats in the new chambers. On January 21, 1861, Senator Jefferson Davis rose to speak.
I am sure I feel no hostility toward you, Senators of the North. I am sure there is not one of you, whatever sharp discussion there may have been between us, to whom I cannot say in the presence of my God, I wish you well.
Abraham Lincoln took the oath of office on the east steps beneath the booms and scaffolding for the colossal new dome of cast iron. Cannon guarded the Capitol grounds. Sharpshooters lined the roof. Despite protest at the cost, Lincoln insisted that work on the unfinished dome go on. I take it as a sign, he said, that the Union will continue. But on April 12, 1861, war came. Now there was another American Congress, the Provisional Congress of the Confederate States of America in Montgomery, Alabama.
Washington City was no longer a name to the mother waiting and praying in the distant hamlet. Her boy was camped on the floor of the rotunda. Never till that hour did the federal city become to the heart of the American people truly the capital of the nation.
The Capitol became a makeshift barracks, then a hospital. Congress and the country were now confronting their greatest crisis. At noon, December 2nd, 1863, as the war dragged on, a 19-foot bronze goddess of freedom triumphant was at last hoisted into place. The Great Dome was finished. In January of 1865, Congress passed a constitutional amendment abolishing slavery everywhere and for all time. Hiram Revels of Mississippi became the first black man ever to serve in the United States Senate, filling the seat last held by Jefferson Davis. Only one Southern senator had remained loyal to the Union, Vice President Andrew Johnson of Tennessee. When he assumed the presidency after Lincoln's assassination, a violent power struggle broke out between Congress and the executive. Johnson's Reconstruction plan was too lenient for radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, who wanted to vigorously enforce civil rights throughout the South. In 1868, Congress voted to impeach the president. Johnson survived removal by only one vote. But Congress, not the president, would continue to dominate Washington for the next 3 decades.
Not a bad desk either. Daniel Webster used to use it.
Daniel Webster sat here?
Give you something to shoot at, Senator, if you figure on doing any talking.
Oh, no, I'm just going to sit around and listen.
That's a way to get reelected.
These hardy knaves and stupid fools, some apish and pragmatic mules, some servile acquiescing tools, these compose the Congress. When Jove resolved to send a curse and all the woes of life rehearse, not plague, not famine, but much worse, he cursed us with a Congress.
Government during the first 76 years meant building and then saving a nation. Now, in the aftermath of Civil War, it often meant exploiting it.
It could probably be shown by facts and figures that there is no distinctly Native American criminal class except Congress. Reader, suppose you were an idiot. And suppose you were a member of Congress. But I repeat myself, Mark Twain.
The lead parts on Capitol Hill now were assumed by a new breed, the bosses. Through their political machines and the power of patronage, many senators controlled the state legislatures that elected them.
Scarcely any of the great railway men go into Congress. a fact of much significance when one considers that they are really the most powerful people in the country. The absence of railwaymen by no means implies the absence of railway influence, for it is as easy for a company to influence legislation from without Congress as from within.
We meet in the midst of a nation brought to the verge of moral, political, and material ruin. Corruption dominates. From the same prolific womb of injustice, we breed the two great classes, tramps and millionaires.
Leland Stanford of California was president and director of the Central Pacific Railroad the whole time he sat in the Senate, now known as the Millionaires Club. But most conspicuous of the bosses was Senator Roscoe Conkling, Republican of New York. He was handsome and hugely vain. Women thought him gorgeous. He was for big business and the railroads. They made the country great. He sneered at reformers and called the civil service the snivel service.
The contempt of that large-minded gentleman is so wilting. His haughty disdain, his grandiloquent swell, his majestic supereminent turkey-gobbler strut has been so crushing that it was an act of the greatest temerity for me to venture upon a controversy with him. James G. Blaine.
Conkling's chief rival for the public spotlight was Speaker James Gillespie Blaine of Maine. Able and warm-hearted, he might have become president had he not, like so many others, accepted financial support from the interests. In his case, the Little Rock Railroad. He became the symbol of a whole political era, the tattooed man. In the deadlocked presidential election of 1876, a backroom deal between Republican and Democratic bosses in Congress sent Rutherford B. Hayes to the presidency, instead of Samuel Tilden, who had actually won the popular vote. In exchange, federal troops were withdrawn from the South. Reconstruction collapsed. The few blacks in Congress disappeared almost overnight. It would be 75 years before Congress seriously considered civil rights again.
This, Mr. Chairman, is perhaps the Negro's temporary farewell to the American Congress. Let me say, Phoenix-like, he will rise up someday and come again. Representative George White.
But even in the age of the bosses, Congress passed the Land Grant College Act, granted millions of acres to homesteaders, finally enacted civil service reform, and set up the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate the railroads. Government and the Congress grew, and one man in Washington was big enough to keep it all going.
He was a slow-moving giant hulk, out of whose collar rose an enormous, round, clean-shaven baby face like a cassava melon from a fat black stalk.
He was also distinguished by his belief that the purpose of Congress was to accomplish something, and in the end, he gave up his power on a matter of principle. Thomas Brackett Reed of Maine, the Speaker of the House, stood 6'3" and weighed nearly 300 pounds. His wit could be withering. He remarked of two colleagues that they never opened their mouths without subtracting from the sum of human knowledge. And he defined a statesman as a successful politician who is dead. On seeing his portrait, as rendered by John Singer Sargent, Reed said, "All my enemies are revenged." When asked whether he would attend the funeral of a political enemy, Reed said, "No, but I approve of it." He was called Czar Reed. In one stormy session, relying on his authority as Speaker, he began to count as present any member currently in the chamber, whether he answered the roll call or not. Members screamed in outrage, and when Reed kept on counting, hid under their desks. The Speaker kept on, and when others tried to leave, he had the doors locked. From then on, Reed rules were in effect. A minority could no longer block legislation with its silence. Reed's 51st Congress in 1889 was the first to spend $1 billion in peacetime. To handle it all, members of Congress were finally authorized to maintain a personal staff of one. And still the country was growing. Hawaii was annexed in 1897. The next year, the Spanish-American War brought Puerto Rico and the Philippine Islands into the American Empire. Reed liked none of it. Imperialism, he believed, was contrary to American ideals.
At the beginning of this year, the quarrels which other nations have, we did not have. Our drumbeat did not encircle the world with our martial airs. Our guns were not called upon to throw projectiles, which cost each of them the price of a happy home. Thomas Brackett Reed.
Rather than preside over a House that supported a policy he despised, he resigned. Asked once if his party was likely ever to nominate him for the presidency, Reed said, "They might do worse, and I think they will." He went out on the eve of the new century.
Great bosses are not the story of the Congress or of American politics. The Congress is the story, and how in the end it always asserts itself against the bosses, and the public view does prevail.
Century, all kinds of miraculous events were taking place, changes taking place, and people felt the country had grown too big, that the government was out of touch with the people, that there were many people in society who were not getting a fair shake, and they wanted that corrected.
I have been a member of this House 3 successive sessions, and during that time I have caught the measles, the whooping cough, and the influenza, but I have never been able to catch the Speaker's eye.
For reform-minded congressmen in 1910, the sins of the old order could be summed up in a name: Joseph Gurney Cannon, Speaker of the House, known as Foul-Mouthed Joe.
Uncle Joe's restless teeth bit off large, untidy sections from the near end of a maltreated cigar, until his wet lips were strewn with sodden, shredded leaves, and the neglected, fitful smolder at the cigar's far end seemed to be in a greater danger from flood than from fire.
He swore unrepentantly, spat into an umbrella stand when no spittoon was handy, and boasted, "I have oats in my pocket and hayseed in my hair." Nobody disliked Uncle Joe personally, but as Speaker, he was the absolute dictator his opponents called him. The voters of Danville, Illinois had first sent him to Congress in 1872. And his beliefs had not changed since then. He ran the Rules Committee, and the Rules Committee decided which bills should be considered. No bill came to the floor of which he did not approve. One after another, he strangled progressive measures to regulate the railroads, break up the trusts, guard public health and public lands.
I am goddamn tired of listening to all this babble for reform. America's a hell of a success. The country don't need any legislation.
No one who valued his career in Congress dared cross him, until 1910. The revolt was led by an idealistic former judge from Red Willow County, Nebraska, a progressive Republican named George W. Norris. On St. Patrick's Day, with Cannon's Irish allies out of the House, Norris introduced a resolution that he'd been carrying in his pocket for months. It gave the House, not the Speaker, the power to elect the Rules Committee. Cannon ruled it out of order, but was himself overruled by a combination of Democrats and insurgent Republicans. After 29 hours of debate, the resolution carried. The iron rule of Speaker Cannon was ended.
For 3 days, Uncle Joe has been like an old gray wolf at bay. I don't especially admire him. He is a flippant, coarse-natured, brazen old man. But today I'm sorry for him.
It was an extremely important change in our country because Joe Cannon stood for no change. What is was what should remain, in his view, when in fact we did need legislation, and these insurgents, progressives, spoke out.
The supreme issue is the encroachment of the powerful few upon the rights of the many. It is against the system built up by privilege that we must make unceasing warfare. Robert La Follette.
Senator Robert M. La Follette of Wisconsin, charging that fewer than 100 men controlled the great business interests of the whole nation, became the conscience of the new progressive movement.
Collier's Weekly. 50 years from now, the future historians will say that this was the period of the greatest ethical advance made by this nation in any decade.
There was unprecedented cooperation now between the new progressive Congress and the new progressive president, Woodrow Wilson. A former professor of history, Wilson had once written a book on congressional government without ever actually visiting Capitol Hill. His thesis was that Congress didn't work very well. Calling Congress into special session in the spring of 1913, he went in person to present his program, something no president had done since John Adams. By custom, Congress took long recesses, but Wilson would keep the 63rd Congress in Washington fighting and arguing and making laws for a year and a half straight. The 63rd Congress was the last Congress before the 17th Amendment transferred the election of senators from the state legislatures to the people. It was the greatest single change in Congress in its history. A graduated income tax was adopted. A Federal Reserve Act stabilized the nation's banking system. Congress went on to pass tougher antitrust laws and create the Federal Trade Commission, improve conditions for merchant sailors, ease credit for farmers, provide workmen's compensation for federal employees, and limit child labor in mines and factories. But everything changed on the rainy night of April 2nd, 1917, when President Wilson went before another extraordinary session of Congress, this time to ask for a declaration of war against Germany. On the morning of Wilson's speech, the first woman ever to serve in Congress took her seat far back on the Republican side, Jeanette Rankin of Montana.
I love my country, but I cannot vote for war. I vote no.
She was not alone, but other progressives voted for war and split the movement. The alliance between Congress and the president ended in a quarrel over America's role in the world. By the 1920s, crusades and crusaders were out of fashion. The Speaker of the House was Nicholas Longworth, a dapper, popular Ohio Republican who had no interest whatsoever in reform. There were still men on Capitol Hill who wore white linen suits and black bow ties, who looked like the cartoonist's image of the old-time politician, and dipped snuff from the lacquer box on the Senate rostrum. But there were younger voices, too. Congressman Fiorello LaGuardia was one. A progressive Republican and sometimes socialist from New York, he could denounce exploiters in 6 languages. And there was one unyielding old voice. For years, George Norris fought almost alone trying to develop the resources of the Tennessee Valley, a part of the country where he had no constituents, but a property, he said, which belongs to all of us, a source of human happiness. Now, in 1932, the people sent heavy Democratic majorities to Congress and Franklin Delano Roosevelt to the White House. Their partnership would transform American government and make a reality of George Norris's dream. The Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA, including the giant Norris Dam, became a showpiece for the new generation of progressives that called themselves New Dealers.
This autogyro won't be as much up in the air as the Senate was in balancing the budget.
In the midst of the Great Depression, the progressive movement continued. New Deal legislation represented the most sweeping reforms in history. Foremost among the New Dealers was Senator Robert Wagner, born in Germany, soft-spoken but tough-minded, who had learned his politics in the New York City streets. Legislation he sponsored guaranteed labor's right to organize, provided Social Security to the elderly, and public housing for the poor. And there were others. Congressman Sam Rayburn of Texas, and his eager young protege, Lyndon Johnson. In the Senate, Hugo Black of Alabama, Alben Barkley of Kentucky, Harry Truman of Missouri. The old progressive call was being sounded now by Robert M. La Follette, Jr.
Harry Truman used to say, "If you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen." But in July of 1935, if congressmen couldn't stand the heat, they'd have to get out of Washington, where the temperature hit 105 degrees. And if there was one congressman who always let his constituents know how hot things were in the nation's capital, it was Cowboy Congressman Percy Gassaway.
I never saw such hot weather in my life. I'll tell you what's a fact, Mr. Congressman. I can actually cook an egg right here in a frying pan on the steps of this house building right now.
The heat wave became a hard-boiled fact. But like the egg, Congressman Gassaway kept his sunny side up.
Boy, listen here. This is the hottest place this side of hell, believe me. You're telling me.
On a chill night in December 1941, the Capitol dome was a blaze of lights. The following day, the president went before Congress.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
It was just electric, the feeling in there. In fact, it was a combination of fear and excitement and determination, and not only could you feel it, but you could smell it. It was almost like the smell of a high school gym before the big game.
Foster, aye. Creel, aye. Culkin, aye. Cunningham.
On this roll call, 388 members voted aye. 1 voted no, the rules are suspended, and the resolution is agreed to.
This time, only one member of Congress opposed a declaration of war. As she had in 1917, Jeanette Rankin voted no.
I have resolved that it's a hat. It's a hat. It's a very majestic, nice hat, but a little bit ludicrous on something that we all care very much about, which is the democratic system and the notion that the people are under that hat somewhere. The body politic, to stretch that metaphor, is at work, and that we're all okay, and that the people are being represented under that thing. And I can live with that corny thought.
It's almost a reverence that like being in a Russian cathedral or a Greek cathedral, where when you look up to the dome, there's the icons and the various saints, and God himself is looking down at you. Well, I have that feeling that I'm in a political cathedral, the world's greatest political cathedral.
It's not just beautiful to walk into from the outside, but you walk in and there are tiles on the floors and mosaics on the ceilings, and you'll just come upon some totally accidental spot where there'll be stained glass out of the blue, or they're just windows leading to nowhere, or stairs that dead end someplace, and it's great fun to tiptoe around it. It would be a true disaster if the modern demands of security keep American children from the ability to just sort of roam the Capitol building.
It's like a little town or a small medieval state. There's a bank, there's a post office, there's a subway, it has its own police force, something like 44 doorkeepers, no end of clerks. There's a carpentry shop, an upholsterer, a resident architect, a resident physician. There's a daily newspaper, a Congressional Record. There are restaurants. It's a world within a world. And some people, I think, probably never come out. There's at least one ghost.
The Capitol building contains its own history. I mean, you can go deep enough, you find some old tubs in the basement where the old members could go 2 centuries ago and get a hot bath or whatever. It's all there, and the way it's grown and expanded is all marked on the walls. So if you like museums, it's the best museum in the United States. But it's a museum in which the life throbs every day.
And from this point, a whisper can be heard 50 feet away due to an architectural defect. John Quincy Adams would sit here at his desk pretending like he was taking a cat nap. He was really listening to the opposition on the other side.
And it's also a kind of a wonderful place if you just let yourself have the freedom to do it. To stand still for a moment and look at the people who are coming there to see their Congress at work. It's marvelous to see their expressions as the dignity and the beauty of that building reach them for the first time. One of the things I'm going to do when I retire, and it sounds ridiculous, is just give myself a few weeks to explore the Capitol building. I have been covering up there for 30 years now, and I still get lost in that building.
In the old House of Representatives, which is now Statuary Hall, the members of the House looked up at two statues, which are still there. One is a figure representing liberty, and the other, behind them, was Clio, the muse of history, keeping note of their actions and holding the clock. Very important idea that what they did there didn't just matter at the moment, but for time to come, that they would be measured by history, that they had to live up to standards that would be set by historical precedent. Well, you know what they look up to in the present-day House of Representatives: the television cameras.
I, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
After the war, business went on as usual in the cloakrooms, back corridors, and dining rooms. There was the old backslapping, arm twisting, lapel grabbing, handshaking, finger jabbing, head scratching, and lint picking. Crusades were mounted against jellyfish and comic books, to make chili without beans the official food of the United States, and to establish a National Mule Appreciation Day. But now America was a world power, and the forces that had provoked and stirred the country from the start, growth and civil rights, had become inseparable, and they confronted Congress everywhere. The recovery of Europe and military intervention, voting rights and civil liberties, the exploration of space and the responsibility of science, and the old conflict of power and ethics. The heroes on the Hill were no longer great orators. They were committee chairmen, investigators, and managers.
The total number of votes cast is 426, of which the Honorable Sam Rayburn has received 217. Therefore, Honorable Sam Rayburn is duly elected Speaker of the House of Representatives for the 78th Congress.
The ultimate manager was Sam Rayburn of Texas, who served in Congress for 48 years, 17 of them as Speaker of the House. He preferred persuasion to power and distrusted speech-making, telling generation after generation of newcomers, "You don't have to explain what you don't say."
One day I was leaving the Capitol and I ran into Sam Rayburn. And he was outside and he looked at me as I came out. I said, Mr. Speaker, and he says, what are you doing? I said, nothing. So he said, well, come with me. And so the two of us walked around the Capitol from the House side to the West side, all the way around to the Senate side and back again. And during the whole time, he was telling me about what he thought of the Capitol. He says, this has been my home. It's been my whole life. It's been my wife. It's been my children. I love this old building.
Congress doesn't just legislate, of course, it investigates, and particularly in the era of television, we have come to understand that this investigative power is not only an aspect of congressional character and congressional performance, but it's a way in which certain individuals in Congress become instantly, overnight, famous.
Answer that yes or no. Do you know this man?
I will not answer it yes or no. My answer to the question is...
You are ordered to answer it.
I'm answering it the way I can. I've said that your statements about him have made it unsafe for me to answer that question, and I will therefore refuse to answer the question on the ground that it will tend to incriminate me.
You have that right if you think it would incriminate you.
And I would be very happy to have our legal counsel here, our legislative representative here, assisting me in spending as much time as necessary to acquaint the American people with the fact that this is a strike-breaking, union-busting bill, in my opinion.
Mr. Hoffa, this bill is not a strike-breaking, union-busting bill. You're the best argument I know for it. Your testimony here this afternoon, your complete indifference to the fact that numerous people who hold responsible positions in your union come before this committee and take the Fifth Amendment because an honest answer might tend to incriminate them. Your complete indifference to it, I think, makes this bill essential.
In the 1950s, Congress and the country were conservative, and legislators were divided between show horses and workhorses. One who came to combine the qualities of both was silver-tongued Senator Everett Dirksen, conservative Republican of Illinois, known to his colleagues as the Wizard of Ooze.
Senator Dirksen, I think, was a shrewd political clown, but in the sense that he used humor to make his points and to put down people. Not once did he ever call me George. He'd always say, "Dear boy, what can I do for you, dear boy?" Maggie Smith used to always introduce legislation to make the rose a national flower, and Dirksen would always get up and oppose her, and he'd say, you know, a rose by any other name would be as sweet as a senior senator from Maine. But as for me, give me the marigold, who asks of nothing except a little spot in the garden and a little care. So, and then Margaret would go down in defeat.
And the Capitol gets its face washed by the fire department. They do a thorough job, and the statues emerge dripping but spotless. And with no dirt left on their doorstep, Congress can get away to a fresh start. All this proves that while you can't take the government to the cleaners, you can take the cleaners to the government.
We enjoy bashing Congress and have since before Mark Twain because there's something ludicrous about ordinary mortals being that pompous. There's something just funny about ordinary people, which is what the founders had in mind. The representatives of ordinary people being so formal, so bureaucratic, so structured, so filled with sort of not quite American graciousness.
It's the only group of people in this country that has to go out year after year and beg for their job and say, please, please, please send me back to that building with the dome. And so that it makes you feel superior to the Congress because you're the people who get to decide that.
We enjoy bashing Congress because they are us. We have no illusions. We know that they do essentially represent the good and the bad in us. And what's an easier scapegoat than to pick on somebody who has the job, has the responsibility, and is supposed to rise above us, and so often fails to rise above us.
Mr. Eves.
Somebody better wake up McCaffrey.
Yes.
We need his vote.
Mr. Evans.
McCaffrey is asleep again.
Mr. Everett.
Wake up McCaffrey. We need his vote.
Mr. Farmer.
No.
Mr. Foley.
Yes.
Mr. Frank.
Opposed, sir.
Mr.
I'm opposed.
Gadsden.
No, Senator, not yet.
No.
And I believe that you're not opposed.
Congress is a takeoff on itself at the surface, and the public picks that up fast. But ask the public about its congressman. How's your congressman? Well, he's better than those other ones. He's pretty good. I've known a guy, knew his grandmother. He's all right. He's pretty good. The average American member of Congress gets about a 60-65% approval rating from his or her own constituents. The rest of Congress ranks below newspapermen for having any quality.
The criticism of Congress that says, in essence, Congress has a way of making situations complicated, of making it harder to do things, of making it impossible to move in a streamlined fashion. This is a way of saying that democracy is a pain in the neck, which of course it is. And that style of criticism of Congress is not so much a criticism of the individuals who are there now, many of whom deserve even more criticism than they have received, so much as it is a criticism of the whole idea of a government by as well as for the people. And that is a criticism of democracy. I wonder whether the ideal of democracy lives in a real sense in our country today.
In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today.
I don't think I've seen any debates that came closer to really dealing with the heart and soul of America than the debates on civil rights in the late 50s and 1960s. These were people who knew that they had been cast by history in the position of righting a historic wrong. And they entered that debate knowing that they would be judged by this chapter of their lives more than any other part of it. That was the highest drama I've ever seen up there.
Civil rights could no longer be ignored, but Congress still seemed unable to act as filibuster after filibuster thwarted the majority will, turning back or weakening every civil rights measure that came before it. Congress was not yet ready to lead.
I stood and sat and crouched in the rotunda all night when John F. Kennedy lay in state. And I remember that night there were just the honor guard and a pretty steady flow of people. And here came at some moment before dawn old Everett Dirksen, the Republican leader, and stood in the rotunda with me and two casual tourists and talked about the Congress, talked about the Capitol, talked about John Kennedy. Other members of Congress wandered through. policemen and guards joined, and we talked all night about the Capitol, the Congress, the traditions of the country. Jokes were told. We had funny times. Dirksen told hilarious stories about Kennedy, about the Capitol, about the history of the country. There was no stuffy reverence involved. It was the best possible wake, and it was the best night in the Capitol that I could ever imagine.
Now, with Lyndon Johnson, the Senate's most masterful manager in the White House, Congress moved at last to make good on the promise of the Constitution, passing the most sweeping civil rights bill since Reconstruction. Stronger than all the armies on earth, Everett Dirksen reminded his colleagues, is an idea whose time has come. The time has come for equal opportunity. Words could still change votes.
It elevates me to see the dome, but then I begin to think of what happens under that dome, and I get de-elevated. What part of us are they representing? Are they representing our real needs, or are they representing our artificial needs, our selfish needs, or are they representing the best in us? Most of our government is an elaborate set of compromises. It's really the political equivalent to the stock exchange on Wall Street. The question is, when government has to rise above trading and brokerage, does it do so? And so often Congress fails to rise above trading.
I think the danger to Congress is the weakening of the party system. We have a bunch of independent operators. It's harder for people to see the point of rallying as a group. That really troubles me because it makes compromise harder. It makes factions that develop around a sort of zealotry of left or right.
Very often they are not voting for or against an issue for the reasons that seem apparent. They're voting for some other reason, because they have a grudge against someone, or because they have to satisfy some old ambition that isn't in no way on the surface, or because they're doing a friend a favor, or because they're willing to risk their political skin and vote their conscience.
Would the president, if there was no resolution, be with or without constitutional authority to send U.S. soldiers to South Vietnam in the numbers that are there today, if there were no resolution?
It would be my view, as I indicated, Mr. Chairman, that he does have that authority.
Would you say the same as to the authority to bomb North Vietnam as opposed to repelling and attacking South Vietnam?
Well, I don't see it as opposed to it.
Well, in
Senator,
contrast,
I believe that the
like.
objectives and the reason that we're in there have been made repeatedly clear.
Well, the answer is yes, then. Is that it?
When I hear members of Congress themselves say, you know, we have abused our power, we have interfered in foreign policy, I say to myself, where did these people study their own history? Legislatures have the right of appropriation so that they may inhibit the powers of the executive. And if they're not proud of that right, they should move aside for somebody to sit there who will take pride in it.
I believe Congress set up the FBI to determine what was going on in this country, didn't it?
Among other things, Mr. Chairman.
It set up the CIA to determine what was going on in respect to foreign intelligence, didn't it?
Yes, sir. Among other agencies.
It set up the National Security Agency, didn't it?
And the Defense Intelligence Agency.
And the Defense Intelligence Agency.
And a number of others.
But it didn't set up the plumbers, did it?
Of course, the Congress doesn't do everything, Mr. Chairman.
No, but Congress is the only one that's got legislative power. And I don't know anything, any law that gave the president the power to set
This is a remarkably strong democracy, and I remember a member of Congress going to Greece right after President Nixon was forced to resign, and saying, do not underestimate the strength of the American democracy. The commander-in-chief of the American Armed Forces was forced out of office, and not one soldier left the barracks to defend him. Now, to us, that's a given. We wouldn't imagine a soldier leaving the barracks, but in most lands, that is very, very unusual indeed.
All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. All those opposed, no.
Mr. Donahue.
Aye.
Mr. Brooks.
Aye.
Mr. Mann.
Aye.
Mr. Sarbanes.
Aye.
Mr. Hutchinson.
No.
Mr. McClory.
No.
Mr. Drinan.
Aye.
Mr. Rangel.
Aye.
Miss Jordan.
Aye.
Mr. Rodino.
Aye.
27 members have voted aye. 11 members have voted no.
I think the finest moment was the last 2 days' hearings of the House Judiciary Committee in 1974, which spoke with such extraordinary seriousness and candor in those 2 days without rhetorical flourishes, which was astonishing, granting that they're Americans. It showed the Supreme Court taught the president that he is the servant of the people and that the people are supreme.
At the end of any session, you always see the stories about the dams in Mississippi or the roads in Tennessee or whatever. But the fact of the matter is that's what they're elected to do. They are here in Washington to represent the energy-producing states versus the energy-using states, the rural areas versus the urban areas. And I think, quite frankly, by the time the whole messy business is over with, Congress after Congress, that they've done a pretty good job of it.
The promise of Congress is that at the heart of the government will be people who are very much like ourselves, who are part of our local community, not separated from it, and bring to the center of government the sensibilities, the sensitivities, and we hope, the common sense that you find in American communities across the land.
I'm hopelessly optimistic, disqualified of any intellectual pretenses when I say that, of course, the Republic has a future because the Congress is there and because the Congress works. The system does work. And when we say, oh, but we're moving into a period we can't possibly salvage, we moved into the Civil War. We salvaged. We went on. We've been through nearly every variation of trouble that you can go through. And I think the Congress can adapt to the world of the atom bomb and high technology and has a better chance to prevail than any other way to try. So I'm optimistic.
Madison said self-interest is the engine of government. And you know, somebody got up and said, Mr. Madison, are you saying that the frailty of human nature is the only basis of government? And Madison said, I know no other.
They're listening to him. Anything might happen now.
Just get up off the ground. That's all I ask. Get up there with that lady that's up on top of this Capitol dome. That lady that stands for liberty. Take a look at this country through her eyes if you really want to see something. And you won't just see scenery. You'll see the whole parade of what man's carved out for himself after centuries of fighting. And fighting for something better than just jungle law. Fighting so he can stand on his own 2 feet, free and decent, like he was created. No matter what his race, color, or creed.
What impresses me most is that the founders were willing to trust to human personality and human intelligence, that man, woman, after all, is not entirely misguided, that we have the wits to solve our own problems, that the best judge of how we should be led and governed is us.
Let me say to the gentleman, further reserving the right to object, let me say to the gentleman that the problem is that democracy sometimes gets a little messy. And you do, in fact, when you're managing bills under
No other agriculture exporting country is taking the whipping like we are in the international market.
House Joint Resolution 412, joint resolution to congratulate King Bhumibol Adulyadej of Thailand on his 60th birthday on December 5,
There are 16 Virginia sandstone columns. On top of each column for decoration, we have tobacco leaf and the tobacco blossom.
What did the president know? And when did he know it?
I reserve the right to object. I'm trying to figure out what it is we're doing here. Do I understand we are now
This bill
coming
is back not to what the poor need, it's not what the country needs, and it's certainly not what this Congress should pass.
Mr. Speaker, I want to associate myself with the remarks made by Congressman Tom Bevel today on the 5-inch guided projectile. And I ask you that
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to take from the Speaker's desk H.J. Res. 412 and ask for its
I ask
immediate
unanimous
consideration.
consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks on H.J. Res.
I understand that we are now going to try by unanimous consent to overturn the provisions of the rule by which this bill was brought to the floor that limited time of debate.
I congratulate the Clean City Committees and the cities of western Nebraska, North Platte, Ogallala, Kimball,
I
Scottsbluff,
believe
Geary,
Congress
and
set up
Alliance.
the FBI to determine what was going on in this country, didn't it?
Among other things, Mr.
Yes.
Chairman.
It set up the CIA to determine what was going on.
27 members have voted aye. 11 members have voted no.
Will the gentleman yield? In my opinion, and I'm not going to object to this, but I will tell the gentleman that
The committee will recess until 10:30 Monday next.
10:30 when? Monday morning.
Monday morning.
Monday night, you said.
Monday next.
Oh, Monday.
About 40 women showed up. They were elderly. They were concerned with Social Security. So they sent a note into Dirksen, who was on the floor. So he comes tippy-toeing out with that great mass of white hair, just looking the way he does, and he looks up and down and he says, "Girls, I was on the floor defending the Republic against the onslaughts of the opposition when I was informed that 40 lovely ladies wished to see me. I immediately removed the armor of the warrior and put on the cloak of the poet. Now, what do you girls wish of me?" There's absolute silence. And then one little lady in the back pipes up and says, "Nothing, Senator. We just want to hear you talk."